Hey guys, what's up? It's me, fresh out of the shower swim. And today, on this beautiful Monday morning, we're going to be doing some sort of like meta update kind of thing, fill you guys in on how things have been looking in the meta. Sort of like a tier list kind of thing. Maybe I'll eventually make a series out of this. Which, hang on, wait a second. Can we, let's just put this bit aside for a second though. Can we actually appreciate how funny it is? So the last time I did one of these, I said specifically, we weren't going to do them on Mondays anymore. This one was actually supposed this is the first one I've ever done that wasn't actually supposed to be on a Monday. Anyway, this episode is going to be a little bit special. The reason for that being is that this is going to be the last episode of the current patch, and I won't do another one until kind of like probably like the night of the expansion, which people are saying is going to be on the 26th. Apparently that's something that they sort of like have soft announced. We'll see if there's any sort of delay to that. They haven't done any reveals yet, so who knows. But basically the idea is this. Obviously I haven't done a tier update in a little while. This is kind of like the only one I haven't done one for like a full tier update for about 2 weeks now, and I won't do another one after this for like 2 weeks. The reason being is actually like fairly straightforward, just a little bit of burnout on my part, and I apologize for that. I really do. It always kind of feels bad as a content creator to like, because I want to make this promise of like, okay, I'm gonna do this every single week. And, you know, at the sort of patches, I'm very good about that. And then as like things start getting like really like stagnant, it feels very, very, very difficult for me too, especially when like some weeks it feels like there's hardly any changes at all. So, I mean, I can sort of like tell myself, it's only a little bit out of date. Anyway, we've done a full final update, as you can see, to the tier list, and this is for the current meta. There actually have been a few fairly significant changes, and we've tweaked the deck build on a ton of things. So these are going to be the best decks to play for the next 2 weeks until Targon comes out. When the Targon expansion comes out, we're going to do a full page of like Theorycraft decks like we did with the Rising Tides expansion. That's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be really crazy. Like looking back in hindsight, like seeing like which decks we were right about and which decks we were oh so wrong about. Always a ton of fun. And yeah, I really can't wait for that. But this is going to be the last update to the sheet until then. I'm also in this video going to be giving you guys a bit of an abbreviated form. I don't want to make them like super in-depth. I won't be talking too much about the stats in terms of like win rates. I would highly recommend though, if you guys are very interested in that kind of thing, checking out Automobilytics. The biggest thing that I've made sure to optimize is the actual deck lists themselves and making sure that everything is updated for the current meta. Because even though a lot of the deck tierings haven't changed, a lot of the builds for how decks want to be built very much have. For example, the Tempo Endure deck. Let's go ahead and start from the top though with everyone's favorite Ashe Sejuani. This is actually one of the most highly populated decks. This is seen kind of like all over a ladder. You'll see this a ton at lower ranks. And this is the version I'd recommend on ladder right now because of that. This is actually a pretty heavily mirror teched version with a lot less of the aggro potential and a lot more of the just kind of like out value. We've got things like 3 Arachnoid Sentry, 3 Hearthguard, and 2 Babbling Bjerg that'll do just insanely well in the mirror match. So if you're playing Ashe Sejuani and you're running into a decent amount of mirrors, this is going to be the version of your choice. It's a pretty prototypical, like kind of like mid-range game plan, trying to control out the board and, you know, secure like value on board so that you can get a win. The more like aggro skewed version, which was kind of like more of an old school thing, this was running like Kato, Reckless Trifarian, and Ferran, I think has been a bit more phased out these days because it's a lot less good in the mirror, and it's a lot less good, you know, outside of kind of the sort of narrow meta we had back then. A lot of like Heimerdingers and stuff where you just wanted to punch through. All right, next up we've got good old Ezreal TF. Hasn't really gone anywhere as a deck. Now, a ton of people are experimenting with different forms of Ezreal. And Ezreal, as well as TF, by the way, a ton of people are experimenting with different forms of TF. There's many different directions to take both of these concepts in, but the like kind of like Ezreal TF, pretty much the most standard version, hasn't changed too much at all. We're running a couple of Zaunite Urchins because it's just a pretty valuable cycle tool since it's, you know, been added to the game in its kind of new form, because before they buffed it, it was a quite bad card. Now it just allows you to cycle, be a little bit more efficient as a deck, and get better at yeah, just kind of the consistency that a combo deck like this really needs, right? Now you can run one of a lot of Ezreal decks. The thing is, you might say, well, Swim, why can't you just put like every version of Ezreal on the site? And the reality of the matter is there's like literally probably like 6 different, pretty distinctly different Ezreal decks that people are playing. Some of them look pretty similar, like Ezreal Fizz is not too many cards off of something like Ezreal Twisted Fate here, but it's just too hard to run them all. At the end of the day, there's so many different Ezreal versions. If you are an Ezreal player, you can definitely check out a lot of the different versions that are performing well on Mobalytics. Pretty much most of them are going to perform super well for you right now. One thing in particular is like Ezreal Swain, as good as it is, I think ends up being probably at the point in time a slightly worse version of Twisted Fate Swain. So I'd recommend towards the TF Swain version if you're inclined towards Ezreal Swain. Overall, this is probably the deck that has taken the least amount of changes in the past 2 weeks. Then we've got Tempo Endure. Now this is Precipix, well, it's not his exact version, but it is based off of Precipix's current version of Tempo Endure. It's made a couple of changes from that and the normal version. The biggest of which being this is a much slower version of the deck, and it's a bit more high rolly on the draw as well. Basically, we have decided to play it a lot slower. Precipix was taking stuff like cutting Elise and adding in Sejuani, which I think is a lot better in this current patch as well, just because you really don't want to play for like as committal of a tempo game plan. The way that this deck wants to play is you want to have the ability to have like a very aggressive draw. So aggro cards that can win you the game by high rolling, like for example Cursed Keeper, Ravenous Butcher, Blighted Caretaker, and Callista, are all pretty premium, as well as even Omen Hawk, because Omen Hawk can sometimes high roll you into a win. But Elise, unfortunately, is just like a little too low value and commits you to the aggro game plan in a way that doesn't really give you the ability to just ass pull a win. So ultimately, I think she's a bit better off replaced right now with Sejuani, because it's much more of a slow meta where you want to just make sure you're not running out of value. And Sejuani's going to hit a lot of stuff like mirrors, as well as Ashe Sejuani matchups a lot harder. The 2 Icefall Archers are also really, really good in the current meta. The ability to just kind of like stop an attack for free is just always going to be super premium, and you'll be able to beat a lot of matchups, including the mirror, just by plopping down an Icefall Archer. Okay, next up we've got Swain TF. This is Rattling Bones' version of Swain TF, which was recently #1 on Ranked Ladder, and it is a little bit less consistent on the stats. It's a bit harder to play, but a very high value tier 2 deck. It's a very solid deck as long as you're comfortable playing this approach. You're going to need to play a very reactive game here. You're going to need to take a lot of like committed open passes to just see what your opponent plays first, and it's not a playstyle for everyone, but this is going to be a deck that's bringing in a lot of value. Next up, we've got Nick's version of Fizz Elusives. So it's still a bit of an incomplete archetype. This is basically a less all-in build that was built off of like my Fizz version, and this is definitely an improvement to the archetype for sure. This is an actual like non-meme version of the Fizz like meme decks that you've probably seen me playing, because I love this archetype, and this is, no joke at all, a very, very solid tier 2 deck. It is not impossible for this deck to be tier 1, and there's several people that are saying it is tier 1, and it's close to the line, it really is. This is a super strong concept right now. Basically, off the back of several changes, this is kind of like the new best way to play Elusives, because Ionia got nerfed in a few different ways. Cards like Fizz and Twisted Fate are just insanely well positioned right now, as well as even cards like Golden Narwhal getting buffed recently. A very, very, very unironic addition to this deck. This is kind of like the future of Elusives. But the one thing I'm going to say that's really, really important is if you're playing this deck, you need to hard mulligan for Omen Hawk and Starlit Seer. You should be kicking Elusives out of your hand. You should be kicking Golden Narwhal out of your hand. You should be kicking Fizz out of your hand. This is like the most important thing. If you don't do that, this deck's not going to perform very well. So just make sure you're mulliganing deep for Omen Hawk and Starlit Seer. All right, and then we've got Karma Ezreal. I think Karma Ezreal is actually one of the most underrated decks right now. It's seeing, you know, a lot of other Ezreal versions are seeing play, and of course we're seeing a lot of people cutting Ionia, because don't get me wrong, Ionia is pretty underrepresented at the moment, but I think this deck is pretty close to like it's very easy for this deck to make a big return with like a fairly small meta shift, right? And there's a few reasons for that. The new Steel Tempest is actually pretty powerful. Concussive Palm is, of course, just kind of a juggernaut in general. Like, this card is never, ever going to be bad. Like, it's potentially deciding the meta and potentially just like an insanely solid value card. But for the most part, the ability for this deck to be running like the new Zon Urchin as like a cycle and early stall tool is really, really nice, because it kind of already wanted to be running some stuff like Jury Rig. So ultimately, I do think it's a tier 2 deck right now. It does need to be played very well to even get that tier 2 win rate, but I think that it's a deck that has a lot of potential to return in some form after, you know, some new cards are added. Then we've got Lux Thresh. Lux Thresh is actually performing pretty well. This is BBG's version of Lux Thresh, and basically the idea here is pretty simple. It is effectively a kind of like control, somewhat combo deck where the idea is to just try to get a Radiant Guardian or a Lux to stick on the board to pretty much win you the game, right? There's a couple of different ways we can achieve that. We can use Remembrance on turn 3, which we often are doing. You don't always want to be playing Hapless Aristocrat on turn 1, keep that in mind, even if you have it. So often we're going to be using Remembrance on turn 3, get like a random big dude. Sometimes we can even take a weird Hapless block with Remembrance on turn 3, which is really nice. Oftentimes we're going to be intentionally getting Radiant Guardian with Lifesteal Tough on as soon as turn 5, and the way we can do that is off of Blending Assault. So especially if we're attacking on turn 5 or sometimes turn 6, we really want to be cognizant of this combo, because Blinding Assault summons a scout that just can challenge its way into a death. What you can do is, if you're attacking on turn 5 and you have Blinding Assault and Radiant Guardian in hand, is you can intentionally bank the mana so that on turn 5 you can play Blinding Assault off of your spell mana, sacrifice the Valor on your scout attack, and then play Radiant Guardian into a normal attack on the same turn. This kind of combo is really powerful, and you really need to be watching out for this sort of thing when you're playing this deck, right? So it's all about activating your Radiant Guardian for value, because this is kind of like the big carry card in the deck. Ultimately, we're running a ton of like control cards here, like Concerted Strike and Vengeance. So we're going to be able to outscale most decks in the meta. It's a very, very solid high tier 2 deck at the moment. Misfortune Aggro has been taking a bit of a shift towards the late game. We see versions like this with Quinn performing a little bit better than the Lucian Senna versions in the current meta, and this is gonna be definitely what I would recommend right now. It's actually a deck that has a pretty good performance on ladder. I did mention that I wasn't gonna talk about stats too much, but I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that this deck does have a small sample size, but 58% win rate right now, which is pretty poppin'. Like, it's actually pretty surprising, because it's a deck that got phased out a while ago, but it seems to be sort of like coming back around meta-wise, so to speak. Basically, one of the most important things is we're adding extra copies of like Cytherea and Genevieve. This is now a 5-of slot. We're running 3 Genevieve and 2 Cythereas. And the reason for this is quite simple. The more you have of this card, the better. You just want to be able to slam 1 on 6. And if that hasn't ended the game already, 1 on 7. It's super, super important that we have those cards to be able to finish the game and make sure we're not running out of steam, make sure we win even if our Cytherea gets like thermo beamed, etc. Okay, and that's sort of the brief meta rundown. So I won't be covering in this video Tempo, Sejuani, Kinko, Elusives, or Deep, because these 3 decks haven't really changed in the past like 2 weeks at all. They're basically still the same deck, and it's debatable that these should kind of even be like phased down into tier 3. Some people are arguing that they're less good, but either way, it's like we are covering basically the 8 best archetypes in the entire game. And yeah, that's it. This was kind of like a bit shorter of an update. I normally try to be much more thorough about these kinds of things, but I just want to make sure I'm putting all my energy into, you know, the reveals when they start happening, as well as making sure that, you know, some other side projects. I almost spilled the beans there. Making sure that some other side projects that I'm working on are, well positioned. Okay, so that's the little meta report. I really do want to apologize again for kind of like being very lax and unmotivated about this. I see like so many comments like in YouTube comments or in my Discord where people are like, you know, Swim, when are you gonna update the tier list? And I do feel really bad, because I do pride myself on like keeping this up to date. I know that's funny to say, because probably, I mean, in the last month it really hasn't been up to date very often. I've updated it like once, but it's gonna be obviously a lot easier when there's like the full new card set and there's a lot more to like, you know, keep me and a lot of you guys motivated about the game. So I'm really looking forward to the Targon release, and that's gonna give me you know, a full kind of like fresh take on like delivering this content to you guys. All right, so yeah, that's it for me, and I'll see you guys next time. Okay.